Roots reggae directly invited itself to Africa. Basically, if you listen to the songs of roots reggae, it's basically them demanding citizenship. Right? Right? And they're insisting on themselves as the continent's primary voice. We are the voice of Africa, right? It's powerful. It's also slightly arrogant for a lot of Africans. The tension between those things is what we really have to, that reggae and us who think about these issues have to continually deal with, right? We have to deal with that. So reggae music demanded citizenship. It demanded a right to speak about Africa and to talk about what Africa is dealing with in terms of governance, in terms of politics, in terms of how Africans see themselves in the world, right? In sound, and this is the sweetness of reggae music, roots reggae music, in sound it claimed a remedy for its exile, right? In sound, roots reggae begged for the forgiveness that comes from the sin of distance, right? Now, in keeping with its roots in colonialism, poverty, and an overwhelming sense of machismo and manhood, this sometimes apocalyptic sound, this very utopian fantasy sound, also buried its desire for its fantasies of power and vengeance in a language of justice and liberation, right? Keep in mind, there is always an echo of revenge in revolution and murder in freedom. So the Black diaspora produces these alternate visions of Africa, multiple Africas. This is how it sounds to an African, or not even an African. There's no such thing, right? There's not even Nigerians. There's Igbos and Yorubas and Hausas and Tivs and Efiks and Ijaws and Ibidios. There's so many ethnic groups that don't see this thing called Africa. They've begun to, but I'm talking about a time when they didn't, right? A time when they didn't. So these fantasy Africas produced from outside of Africa, they may have been shaped by desire, nostalgia, racism, slavery, and trauma, but they really come out of the politics inside America and the Caribbean, right? The Africa of roots reggae is less about Africa and more about Jamaica. The language of Africa becomes a way for them to talk about things inside their culture that they can't talk about otherwise, right? So because these visions of Africa actually are about Jamaica or Trinidad or the United States, they're fraught with ambivalence and fear and violence and aggression and beauty, right? And they've also been full of racial and sexual contradictions, right? I don't think I have to tell you that reggae is full of sexual contradictions. Do I need to explain that? I don't think so. Right? And I always try to remind people, you know, when you talk about sexual politics, sexism or homophobia and things like that in reggae, what you're really talking about is how Jamaicans, to use the Jamaicans as an example, talk about culture, politics, history, and all these abstract things in the one language they know, which is bodies, human bodies, right? So when they're talking about sex, they're talking about bodies, they're talking about class, they're talking about history. It's not an accident that the obsession with Mama Africa is an interesting balance to the obsession with Punani. Thank you for that. Now, when you express all of this in musical terms, right? All of these invented or possible Africas, they've all been grounded or made legitimate by the most important metaphor in the history of humankind, in my humble view. And that is the metaphor, the most unstable and powerful metaphor, and that's the metaphor of roots, right? And it's important for me to emphasize that roots is a dominant metaphor. Reggae makes it clear that roots is what it's about, roots reggae. But, you know, in a world divided and described and structured by relentless migration, people moving all over the world at all times, what's the most constant? An obsession with roots, right? And it's a metaphor because you really need an obsession. You really need a language of roots when you're in motion. You don't need a language of roots when you're placed in one place. That's the last thing you really need. right? So that's the beauty of reggae roots. It's about movement. It's about the impossibility of having roots, right? You create the thing you can't have. And that's why roots reggae really celebrates this metaphor of roots, but it's an unstable metaphor, right? Now, back to the Africans, the merely real and the literal Africans. For people like Lucky Dube, African roots, well, it made no sense, right? If you're in Africa, you may have Zulu roots, Xhosa roots, etc. But even the discourse and the notion of roots is not that important. Certainly it wasn't at the time. In a minute I'll talk about why it was important for someone like Lucky Dube, because this imported fantasy Africa, for him, was important because he was a victim of apartheid, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. But for Africans, they lack the distance that gives gravity and power to your longing, right? I mean, the love and longing for Africa and the celebration of Africa came from those who felt removed from it. That makes sense. But what would Lucky Dube, what would they do, right? Africa for them wasn't something that they were removed from because of slavery or exile, right? So for someone like Lucky Dube, he lacked the geographical distance that gave gravity and power to his desire, that made him think of Africa as a metaphor, right? Ironically, it's almost as if his murder will allow him to finally be accepted in reggae music, right? Not as an African, but as a dead African, as someone who was murdered in a language that dancehall massive understand, right? Because this is a world that I'm talking about in the context of the diaspora. He understood that in the black world, their celebration of Africa, fantasies of Africa, the possible Africas, were so powerful that they erased Africa, right? The fantasy erases the reality. And for an African reggae musician, this was a very strange situation to be in. Because the Africa that reggae allowed him to talk about was not the Africa that he lived in. So what was he to do? So, in his brief and productive life, Lucky Dube was aware of this very curious position of being merely a real African in an African diaspora that had so fantasized about Africa that there was no room for him, right? So of course he had to then imitate the Jamaican fantasy of Africa in order to be an African. Right? He knew that the international black world required the symbolic and fantasy vision of Africa for moral power, for political charge, but ignored the Africa he was talking about and feeling and experiencing, right? So his awareness of the curiosity of this situation is reflected in the fact that he chose roots reggae music to make to express himself in apartheid South Africa, but also against the black diaspora that had announced itself through books, but largely through radio, through vinyl, on screen, and of course increasingly on the internet. He had to deal with the Africa coming from outside, right? So for Lucky Dube and the generations of musicians from West and South Africa, reggae may have found itself back home, but it did so as the preeminent form in the black world, art form and musical form, to define itself in global and international terms, right? But also, as I've said, by bringing into it all of the assumptions of black radical thought.